Our next presenter is Toby Ife-Adediran, who is currently a doctoral student and presidential scholar at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences and the Department of Theology and Ethics here at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He's also a Baptist clergyman and a physicist who's interested in the sustainable advancement of science and technology in Africa. The floor is yours, Toby.
Thank you, Braden. I'm going to share my screen. Great. Okay, so thank you so much, Braden, for this great conference. It's been very enriching, the different dimensions that have been explored. And I also want to thank you, Bob and Ted, for the great work you do at the CTNS. I've learned so much from you as a doctoral student at the CTNS and at the GTU. So I'm going to be presenting on the communal, mystical, and deontic morality in African thoughts, an ethical tension for virtuous AI. So my presentation is just going to follow this outline. There's going to be an introduction, which will include the overview of the paper and the question that I intend to address for this conference, the understanding of virtue in Africa, particularly the three elements that are highlighted in the title, what my argument is, and then I'm going to be treating AI virtue on the three domains, which are the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. And then I'm going to present a conclusion. So this paper utilizes the communal, mystical, and deontic moral qualities of traditional African societies to demonstrate the tension in conceptualizing AI virtue to be in absolute or total conformance with human virtue. But this does not necessarily imply that, like many other presenters have said, that AI cannot have a different concept of virtue apart from what human virtue is understood to be. So for AI, virtue can be appropriated in its cognitive and psychomotor domains, which later on are referred to as the front and back ends. AI virtue is herein presented as a social quality with accompanying moral implications of justification and responsibility for its users and developers respectively. The social characterization of virtuous AI places a significant demand on reinforcement machine learning and the social moral awareness of AI developers. So this is an overview of the paper. So there are three core questions in this conference, and this paper particularly addresses the third question: is AI capable of virtue? And that is going to be answered from the African perspective and understanding of virtue. And then AI virtues similar to those of humans. And I try to develop a model for how AI virtue should be, understood, or how AI virtue can be understood. So the argument is that the communal, mystical, and obligatory qualities of African morality counteract a direct mapping between artificial intelligence and human virtue. But for AI virtue can be construed as a social quality for AI with moral implications of justification and responsibility for the users of AI as well as the developers. So the users are going to justify the social quality from a moral perspective, and the developers actually bear the moral responsibility in terms of agency. Okay, so virtue in Africa. So virtue is contextual. The context could be religious, it could be cultural, and so for virtue in Africa, many African cultures place a high premium on virtuous living. So it's not just an ethical concept or moral concept. Virtue actually has to do with the identity and the history of Africans, especially in traditional societies. And virtue is an acceptance and validation factor in many communities. And so people who will be regarded as a member of a community would have particular virtues that are expected to demonstrate. And it could be very challenging for people who do not demonstrate those set of values that are appreciated or expected within those communities. Historical narratives and identities are centered around virtue and character. And so there are metaphors in the African context that are used to describe virtue. So those who are virtuous are regarded as beautiful. Virtue has a lot to do with wealth, with strength, and with bliss. Vices, on the other hand, are taboos. In many African societies, they are sacrilegious, they are forbidden, alien, and even shameful. So virtue is really tied around African identity and acceptance. So the first quality, African, quality is of virtue has to do with virtue in a communal setting. So virtue in Africa is conceived in very relational terms rather than in individual terms. Virtue, virtue is conceived as being so only if it contributes to communal flourishing. And so some of the very prominent virtues in the African context are hospitality, empathy, goodwill, selflessness, transparency, and generosity. So a person is not identified as virtuous until that virtue translates into communal benefit. And so it has to be relational rather than an individual concept or understanding of virtue. And within that community, there is a sense of identity of who belongs to that community. And so communal virtue cannot be expressed until a person, so to say, is identified as a member of that community. And that leads to the concept of kinship, familyhood. For example, the Ubuntu in South Africa, I am because you are, and the Ujamaa in Tanzania, are premised on the notion of common ancestry between members of the society, kinship, and brotherhood. So there is a connection between who is identified as a member of the community and so who can be described as virtuous. And so it is difficult to graft AI into human ancestral lineage. And then humanoids cannot be said to demonstrate communal virtue in the human sense of the term. So AI, it's difficult within the African framework to integrate AI into brotherhood or integrate AI into kinship or familyhood, which are major key elements of members of a community. So this picture in this slide demonstrates the communal character in traditional African societies. And so moral actions are expected to be in the interest of the common good of the society. And the next is the mystical understanding and demonstration of morality or virtue in the African society. So the communal understanding connects people of the same ancestral lineage And so members of that lineage or members of that community can demonstrate virtue. But there is a wider connection than that, which exists between humans. And this is the cosmotheandric worldview, where there is a connection between the visible and the invisible realm. So there is a connection between nature or the cosmos and persons, and then to divinity. And so this mystical component of morality also ties around the demonstration of virtue. So those who are able to maintain that communication between the mystical, the mystical elements of existence within the traditional and within the African traditional society are considered to be virtuous. And so a person is, for example, said to be courageous if such a person can withstand the euphoria and possibly the activities that take place there, when courage is required to interface between divinity or to interface with ancestors or mystical components. And so AI has not been developed to respond to metaphysical or spiritual impulses. So again, within the African framework, a virtuous person will be somebody who can serve as an intermediary between persons and mystical components, somebody who can translate messages, and things like that. So if AI is unable to respond to these metaphysical impulses, it is difficult to conceptualize AI virtue within the African framework. And then the third one is the Deontic morality, which I've divided into 3 subcategories: the lineage rules, the ceremonial nature, and the embodied requirement, which I think Shannon mentioned in her presentation. So many of African virtue, African traditional virtue, have been sustained as lineage rules that are transmitted across generations as norms, and again, this relates to the communal requirement as well as identity as a member of human ancestry. And many of these lineage rules are observed during ceremonies. For example, many rites of passages like child naming, like wedding ceremonies, like burials, and so on and so forth. So most of these virtues are ceremonial in nature. For example, a child is regarded as one who is virtuous, for example, if there are some signs or symbols that are observed during the birth of that child. In a wedding, for example, the bride is expected to bring good tidings into the new home. And so within that ceremonial framework, if a wedding takes place and there are not, some blessings that are expected are not observed, that person is considered not to be virtuous. And even right on to ancestorship. So ancestors are also expected to demonstrate virtue by providing protection, by blessing efforts and things like that. So there is a ceremonial undertone to the appreciation of virtue in the African society. And then the final part of this is the embodied requirement. So the embodied and lived experiences through which these obligatory moral values are demonstrated cannot be outrightly extrapolated to artificial intelligence. So I kind of appreciate these 2 comments that I have picked from my paper. The first one says the emphasis here is that if human virtue is anything to go by, the ideation of virtuous AI is anything to go by in the ideation of virtuous AI, it is noteworthy that as much as everyone is believed to have the moral capacity to exhibit some virtues, not everyone ends up doing so. So I think this is also a tension in having a direct mapping between AI virtue and human virtue, because there is that capacity in terms of human understanding of virtue, but eventually not everyone ends up doing so. And this is corroborated by the second text by Ife-Adediran in 2004, who mentioned that personhood is a sort of thing which has to be achieved, the sort of thing, at which individuals could fail as well. So including this component of growing, and the possibility of attaining or not attaining virtue, also, represents a tension for the understanding of virtuous AI within the human framework. But this is not a complete write-off for what can be regarded as virtuous AI. So in trying to develop a kind of model for VAI, I described 3 domains: the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor. AI can be virtuous in terms of what I'll later show as a social quality. So I locate the understanding of virtuous AI in both the cognitive and the psychomotor domains, which have to do with what can be programmed in terms of value alignment. So this is a social quality that is based on aligning AI with values that are appreciated within a society, as well as the demonstration of those values. But it's pretty difficult to locate virtue within the affective domain, which has informed the vicious argument about agency, the possibility of AI agency, as well as moral agency and responsibility. Here I describe the validity of the concept of virtuous AI as against AMA, which is artificial moral agency. So the erstwhile artificial moral agents presented in literature feel the vicious contention for the validity of assigning moral agency and responsibility to AI. While virtuous AI should emphasize maximizing this revolutionary technology through a global span of user acceptance and trust. So Shank and Gott present 2 types of anthropomorphism: social anthropomorphism and moral anthropomorphism. And so this model actually situates virtuous AI within social anthropomorphism, such that AI virtue is conceived as a social quality with accompanying moral implications for its users and developers. So this is more, virtuous AI is more of a value alignment within the social framework, particularly for artificial intelligence. And so this paper utilizes the African traditional moral qualities of being communal, of being mystical, of being obligatory, to establish a tension in the conceptualization of AI virtue in total conformance with human virtue. It also argues that virtue in the context of AI should be appropriated in its cognitive and psychomotor domains. AI virtue has been presented as a social quality with accompanying moral implications of justification and responsibility for its users and developers, respectively. This social characterization of VAI places a significant demand on reinforcement machine learning and the social moral awareness of AI developers. I want to thank you for your attention and then invite comments, questions that will be helpful, in improving on this paper. Okay, Shannon, yep.
Well, first, just terrific paper, terrific presentation. Thank you so much. Learned a lot, and I'm fascinated. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about the role of ritual in virtue. In particular, I found myself interested in this space because some of the healing rituals that I had looked into that had to do with helping people recover from something we talked about last time, but PTSD and other moral injuries, made very clear that the ritual itself was irreplaceable, that there were elements of it that you simply could not remove without losing the value for the person's character and future development. And I just wonder if you could say more about how these rituals, every part of them is constructed in a way to form virtue. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shannon. So I'll look at rituals in two dimensions. The first one is that, so those who are considered to be virtuous within the African traditional community are those who particularly have to observe rituals, particularly, some of these rituals are daily, depending on what family, a person comes from, and some of them are really ceremonial. So for example, there is this ritual of feet washing that is required for a woman who is getting married newly to a family. And so it is expected that, this woman in question has to observe that ritual for her to be considered to be virtuous, except there is something she's hiding, and except there is a problem, somewhere. So ritual observance is very, very akin to virtue demonstration in Africa. But the other dimension, which is much more vivid for me, has to do with the requirements in carrying out a ritual. So there are these community rituals in Africa that have particular requirements. For example, there is this one in the southwestern part of Nigeria where a virgin is required to, offer a particular sacrifice within, a virgin within an age group. And so whoever qualifies for this, to observe this ritual for community flourishing, again, is regarded as virtuous. And there are times that consultations are made, and then there is this random person who the deity or who the ancestors choose to offer that particular ritual. And then this person is celebrated within the community as being virtuous, because it is believed that quality of virtue determine the choice of that person, to observe that ritual on behalf of the community. So those are two dimensions that come to mind in terms of virtue and ritual.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Catherine, please go ahead.
Yes. I love this talk. That is so terrific. And I think it's really also so important that, all of the thinking that we've been doing is really centered on this idea of intelligence and intentions and the things that go on in our heads when you're bringing to us, reminding us that there's a whole part of the world for which groupiness and community is really more important than what one person thinks or feels inside of themselves. And I think this cross-cultural information that you're bringing to us is really, really important. So thank you for that. I sincerely mean that. So my question is, so then thinking about this, are there a lot of incidents of AI? Are there robots, or is there much AI exposure in Africa? And if so, what is there a general hesitancy to accept it? Or if not, then maybe we're kind of, I don't know. Anyway, I have no idea what kinds of exposure there is.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine, for your kind comments. So there is a considerable level of exposure and awareness concerning AI in major cities in Africa. But I can say that in many villages, hinterlands, very local communities, one would hardly find a computer,
Right.
not to talk of, an appreciation of AI. But even the major cities, there are still a lot of, even among faith practitioners, many of these deliberations that go, regarding how much should AI be used in daily activities, in decision making, and things like that, still raise a lot of questions, because even members of major cities, those who live in major cities, still have this cultural, still have this reverence for culture and tradition. And so there are a lot of questions as regards how much should I allow AI, influence what I do and the decisions that I make in my daily life. So the short answer would be yes. Within cities, there are robots. AI is used in different applications, like it is used in many parts of the world. But I'll say there is not so much subscription, particularly in individual living. So we could find the use within systems, within organizations who want to utilize AI for profit making and to advance their business. But for very individual usage, there are a lot of skepticism, even within members of major cities.
So along those same lines, then, do you think that Chat GPT, for example, does it give answers that might seem very odd to a society that was more communal rather than individualistic?
For Chat GPT, I think I think for Chat GPT, that kind of solution or initiative is still considered to be more individualistic, because within the African society, there is a lot of emphasis on persons relating with those who are also regarded as persons. And Chat GPT, for example, does not demonstrate personhood within the African society. And so a lot of people are troubled when members of the family spend a lot of time trying to communicate with a computer system or with AI. There is a concern that this is fostering individualism rather than the communal appreciation within African society. So it's going to be considered a tool that fosters individualism. Another thing that is very particular about AI in many African societies, I'll not say all, is the issue of trust. So there are also concerns that many of the data that is obtained using AI are used for ends and for purposes that people are not aware about. So that skepticism, that concern and worry is also really prevalent in the African society. And some people would rather stay away than interact or use AI.
Thank you.
Lawrence?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for a really interesting paper. I'm glad an African perspective got brought into the conference. I'm thinking a lot of, and I'm thinking a lot about your at the end of the paper, crafting of a space for a way of considering virtue for AI as distinctive from human virtue, which is, I'm going to get at a different way via Chinese philosophy in the last paper, which, yes, is a plug to stick around to the end of the conference, since I'm going last. But in thinking about it in the context of the African virtue framework you've elaborated, I'm wondering what mechanism you envision for the communal recognition of that virtue, because it seems that, even if we can program an AI to get there, those issues of trust, right, and of acceptance in the community, and it would seem that there would need to be some sort of ritual for embracing that artificial intelligence into the community. And I wonder if you've thought at all about what that would need to look like in order for communities in Africa to accept AIs on the terms of the virtue that you've identified for them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lawrence. So in the paper, I mentioned that even if AI attains general intelligence or strong intelligence, it's going to be pretty difficult for AI to attain personhood within within the understanding of that concept in the African framework. And it's because within a typical traditional African society, when a person says his name, the next question is, from what ancestral lineage do you come from? And so people are really identified based on their ancestral linkage, and once a person has a name, for example, you can tell what state the person came from and what village the person comes from. And some virtues you can expect that person is going to demonstrate. Is this person from a lineage where they are very humorous or very musically inclined, people who are known to serve nobility and things like that? So there is a lot of identity tied to ancestry and lineage, and people, AI can only will be regarded as a person if that can be incorporated. But I guess it's going to be a tension. It's going to be difficult really within very traditional and local communities.
Well, thank you very much, Toby. Well, thank you very much. Our next presenter is Ali-Reza Bhojani, who's a teaching fellow in Islamic ethics and theology in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Birmingham. And he's also an honorary research fellow at the Al-Mahdi Institute at the University of Nottingham.
Yep. Okay, brilliant. All right. So again, echoing other people's thanks, great thanks to Braden and the team. Also to Mark for encouraging me to take part, and for the people at AI Faith who have helped me in some of my thinking over the last few months in preparing this paper. So the paper has, like others have also shared, my paper's evolved since I wrote the abstract. And so the title is a little different to what you see in the pre-circulated version. So Islamic meta-ethics and the possibility of ethical AI. The central question which I'm starting with or focusing on is, can AI be felicitously described as ethical? So we've been bouncing around this since the beginning, really, of the conference, and it raises a range of ethical questions regarding moral capacity, agency, and responsibility, and questions about the nature of moral language, which maybe we've asked less about, actually, we've discussed less. We had talk of moral language with Thomas's paper, and I think these questions are fundamental to the meta-ethical questions, but also the wider normative ethical questions which are driving lots of the debate. So we've had this discussion about abstract questions and concrete questions. So I think they are related, actually. I think both are related. There is no doubt in my mind that if we solve some of those fundamental questions, or what we've been calling more abstract questions, or even if we can't solve them, if we help clarify them, they can help us better approach and much of the very, very pressing normative ethical questions which have been raised, especially yesterday and the day before. And I want to consider these meta-ethical questions in light of debates on the nature of moral propositions in Islamic thought. And when I started this project, and some of my wider thinking about AI ethics and Islamic thought has been always with a premise, actually, that so I was pulled into discussions of AI ethics initially about just over two years ago, as somebody who works on Islam and works on ethics and might have something to say. All right. So because there wasn't other people, or there wasn't many other people engaging in the questions. And one of my initial premises was, yeah, sure, Islamic thought must have something to contribute to wider discussions, but also that thinking about the questions which are emerging from AI ethics can be a really important and productive platform for Islamic thinking itself. Right. So I'm always going into these questions with this two-way approach, that there should be something for me to gain, not for me personally, but for Islam, it's productive, okay, for thinking per se. All right, whether it's theological thinking, philosophical thinking, ethical thinking, rather than just thinking how we can contribute. often when we think about applied ethical issues, and I think religious discourse Islamic discourse, there's always risks of using these types of engagements simply for apology and polemics, right? And I definitely want to avoid that. So I'm thinking about the scope for Islamic thought to contribute to debates in AI ethics, but also the scope for AI ethics to prompt clarification and rethinking in Islamic thought. So I'm skipping some significant sections of the working paper, but that's because I want to try and get through to hear comments and questions. So, of course, resources for Islamic thinking on AI are broad. We can think about Islamic theology and metaphysics. We could think about Islam's virtue ethics. We can think about Islam's Sharia and jurisprudential traditions. So when we're thinking about Islam's theology and metaphysics, okay, it's very, very core. God is one. So radical emphasis on Tawheed, okay, on the oneness of God is the source of all existence and the source of all life. I emphasize here all, quite intentionally, as the Quran states, reporting the voice of the Prophet Abraham. Abraham says to those people who want to throw him into the fire for breaking their idols, and that God created you and that which you make. All right. So for me, actually, theologically, the distinction between artificial, okay, and natural technology and nature, is a difficult one. Existence has purpose. Yeah, it is accountable to him and returning to him. Now, these theological and metaphysical discourses we could mine through scriptural sources, through discourses of falsafa philosophy, or the hikmah traditions, or the kalam traditions within Islam. Islam's virtue ethics, okay, which sometimes are focused around ethical paradigms, ascetic practices, the rich, rational, philosophical ethics of character, which of course were developed in Muslim thought through their engagement with the Hellenistic tradition, and very influential in that transmission back to Latin Europe. We could think about Islam's virtue ethics through the lens of the supra-rational Sufi discourse towards manifesting godly character, and we could think about resources for Islamic thinking on AI through its Sharia and jurisprudential tradition. Now, it's very clear to me that yes, modern Muslim thinking is dominated by its Sharia discourse. And although I have a critique of that, yeah, I am also somebody who works very closely with Sharia discourse. And seeing Sharia discourse often translated as Islamic law, as a discourse of jurisprudence that seeks action-orientating rules and regulations for all circumstances of life, okay, as instrumental prima facie duties which are in pursuit of virtue. So Sharia, as I mentioned in some discussions earlier today, Sharia is fundamentally conceptualized as being instrumental towards the pursuit of individual and societal virtue. We could look to the discourse of usul al-fiqh, okay, if you like, the methodological discourse of Sharia. And so when in my engagement with the question around the nature of moral propositions, I first and foremost am drawing on debates in Islamic legal theory, or usul al-fiqh, and which came out of Islamic rational theology, or ilm al-kalam. So moving to Islamic metaethics. So Islamic metaethics are often characterized in terms of two classical theories of value. And I'm quoting here from George Hourani's influential works, I should say, starting in 1985. So hopefully these distinctions will be familiar or he's framed them in such a way which makes them familiar and relatable to some of the wider discussions in philosophy of religion. People who are familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma can see the two horns of Euthyphro dilemma here. So on one hand, you had, according to Hourani, Muslims who are subscribing to an ethical voluntarism, advocates of a divine command theory, where ethical value is defined exclusively by revelatory command. Okay, a revelatory command, okay, which is subject to no other condition than God's unadulterated will. So something is good simply because God says it so. whatever God commands is good and virtuous. Whatever he prohibits is bad and vice. So this isn't modified divine command theory. This is a strong divine command theory. Right? Okay, it is the command of God that makes it so. Within Muslim thought, George Hurani at least associated this ethical voluntarism very strongly with the Ash'ari school of Kalam, a major Sunni school of Muslim theology, which is continues to this day as being a very influential source of theological discourse. Hurani contrasts this with the moral objectivists, who held that human reason can understand the goodness or badness of some actions independent of scriptural revelation, intuitively or through reasoning. God commands that which is good and is virtuous. He prohibits that which is bad and is vice. You know, this the moral objectivists theologically are privileging God's justice over God's power, because God cannot do that which is unjust. He would no longer be God. This type of thinking is associated with the Mu'tazili school of Kalam, okay, largely extinct, although there's forms of neo-Mu'tazilism, you know, across Muslim thought today, okay, and associated with Shi'i theology, which I'll draw on later in the talk. Now, the Ash'ari divine command theories. So these are the moral, ethical voluntarists. Yeah, within the classical formulations, they distinguish between three senses of good and bad. Okay, yeah, or husn and qubh in the Arabic, something being hasan or kabir. Three senses of good and bad. And actually, these very much mirror. We can relate to these uses of good and bad, you know, in the English as well, actually. So one, we can use terms good or bad relating to issues of perfection or imperfection. So this is a teleological sense. I can say the table is good, okay, because its function is doing its job. All right, the table is good if I can write on it or I can type on it, okay, without getting repetitive strain because of its position. It's a good table, right? Okay, or a more classical example, learning is good. Okay, why? Because it's a completion for it's good. You know, it helps me fulfill my purpose, right? A second sense we could use the terms good or bad, okay, is related to considerations of pleasure and pain, yeah, or those things which are conducive to the self or not conducive to the self. These types of, if you like, aesthetic judgments, okay, were expanded by Ash'ari thinkers to include judgments of utility and detriment, okay, because I might dislike the bitterness of my coffee, okay, but I enjoy the state of imbibing the caffeine, you know, to keep me awake at this time of the evening here in the UK. So that, yeah, in the coffee is good, or the bitter medicine is good because of the state that it leads to. So they started to say, okay, look, we could talk about good and bad in terms of teleological sense. We could talk about good or bad in terms of utility and detriment, okay? And these are distinct usages of the terms, right? And then we talk about good or bad in the religiously assigned sense, right? So this is a sense which relates to reward and punishment, right? Okay, so for the Ash'ari thinkers, the Hurani's ethical voluntarists, okay, it's the third sense which is tied exclusively to God's commands. Numbers 1 and 2 are rational, okay? If you like, these are human judgments, right? Humans make these judgments all the time. We don't need God's revelation to tell us, okay, yeah, that this is a good table or this is a bad table, okay, or that this has utility or this has detriment. What we need God's revelation for is to tell us whether this action is deserving of reward in God's eyes or whether this action is deserving of blame in God's eyes. Right, so, okay, to the point now, right? So it seems to me that even for the ethical voluntarists amongst Muslims, AI can be appraised with moral language on teleological grounds and utilitarian grounds, right? Okay, these are rational judgments, okay? Yeah, of course, these judgments are only relevant on a human level, right? Okay, and have no correlation with God's judgment of reward and punishment, okay? But the use of moral language with regards to AI seems absolutely plausible with the Ash'ari framework, as long as it's very, very clear that that moral language doesn't relate to God's view, right? And then we could engage with those thinkers to critically assess, okay, yeah, is this good? Is this bad? Okay, yeah, where's the purpose? What's the utility, so on and so forth. So they can come into the conversation and they themselves can engage into a constructive conversation, right? What's important for the Ash'ari thinkers, however, is that any of these judgments have no correlation with God's judgment of reward and punishment, with God's judgment of that which is moral or virtuous, because it's God that defines a, if you like, religiously responsible agent. Okay, and it's God that gives religious responsibility. Okay. Moving away from the voluntarist now. So it seems to me that George Hourani's framing of ethical voluntarism versus moral objectivism is way too polarizing to capture the breadth of Islamic metaethics, okay? Yeah, there are a range of moral rationalisms across Islamic thought, including across Sunni metaethics. So people like the important Maturidi school of Islamic theology, even the traditionalist Hanbali school of Islamic theology were deeply critical of the Ash'ari divine command theory. And of course, Shia theologians like the Mu'tazila, who I referenced above, the archetypal Muslim rationalists, are proponents of a stronger moral rationalism. So I'll call it a stronger moral rationalism, where praiseworthy and blameworthy can be known independent of revelation, and where there is potential correlation between rational judgments of morality and divine judgments of morality. It seems to me that this type of metaethics offers further scope for the usage of moral language to describe AI systems, irrespective of debates amongst these strong moral rationalists on whether the basic moral propositions are factual or conventional. So things like justice is good and oppression is bad, or justice is praiseworthy and oppression is blameworthy, whether such propositions be factual or whether they be conventional, it seems to me that subscribing to this type of strong moral rationalism offers further scope for thinking about transmoral human agency. So going to factualist theories very, very briefly, because I can see time is flying, right? And the use of moral language for AI. So the prevalent view amongst Shia theologians, okay, like the Mu'tazila actually, okay, is that basic moral propositions are factual. You can't take, you can't take blameworthiness out of oppression. Oppression is self-evidently blameworthy, right? So now basic moral propositions can be discovered self-evidently or through reasoning. If something is praiseworthy or blameworthy, then God also recognizes it as so. Right? So if perpetuating misinformation is correctly judged to be blameworthy, right? So there is an epistemic question there, right? So if we correctly identify that perpetuating misinformation, is blameworthy, then surely God would also consider it blameworthy, right? There's a correlation between human judgments and a potential correlation between human judgments and divine judgments. So if an AI system, there's a big if here, and lots of people are going to catch me. I can imagine people might ask me about the if. So if an AI system, okay, is properly responsible for a blameworthy act, rather than its designers and programmers, then reason can understand that God too would consider it blameworthy. Okay? What about conventionalist theories amongst these strong moral rationalists? So the formulation that I look at in the paper is by, not the respected Mudaffar that we have on the call, but a Muhammad Rida Mudaffar, an Iraqi philosopher jurist, okay, who was deeply influenced by the Ash'ari critiques of Mu'tazili moral realism. He argues, following some other thinkers as well, that moral propositions are conventional, not factual, following Ibn Sina. Of course, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, very, very influential in the transmission and monotheistic interpretation of Aristotelian tradition through to Latin Europe as well, right? So moral propositions are conventional, okay? Yeah, these are characterized as reputable or virtuous opinions, what in Arabic is referred to as the Ara al-Mahmuda, within his categorization of syllogisms. So here, there's a potential correlation between human judgments of praise and blame and judgments of the divine legislator, God, in cases of rational consensus. Okay, rational consensus in specific issues. So rational consensus where there's universal judgments of perfection and imperfection. Okay, so universal judgments of teleology. Okay, yeah, or universal shared judgments about utility and detriment relating to the survival of the species. So where everybody agrees that the survival of the species is at risk, we could say that this is a rational consensus, right? And why would this correlate with the judgment of God? Okay, because God is the creator of rationality and the chief rational being. Okay, so I am really talking about the possibility of transhuman moral agency, but possibility. I'm not talking about actuality here, right? The possibility of transhuman moral agency. And of course, the Quran describes a variety of non-human species as moral beings. Now, the Quran is typically read in an androcentric fashion. Okay, never mind an anthropocentric fashion. In an anthropocentric way, okay, it's typically read in an androcentric way. Okay, yeah. Nevertheless, recent scholarship has emphasized, people like Sarah Talili, who I'm mentioning here, that the Quran describes a variety of non-human species, okay, as moral beings capable of facing and making moral choices, such as the jinns, the angels, some other non-human animals. The story of the Quranic narrative of Solomon and the hoopoe bird, okay, depicted in the image that I've got there, okay, describes Solomon as willing to assess the moral agency, okay, of a non-human moral actor. So it says to the bird who says that I'll bring you news of the of the Queen Sheba. Okay, we shall see whether you speak truth. I'll bring you the throne of the Queen Sheba. Okay, faster than you can blink your eye. We shall see whether you speak truth or whether you are of the liars. So not only is a non-human agent capable of moral action, that moral action is capable of appraisal in the Quranic narrative. Of course, when we talk about the possibility of AI as moral actors, any moral agency, of course, assumes moral capacity. Okay, so it assumes actual capacity. And at the very minimum, there has to be an ability to recognize and choose to either act in accordance with or contravention of the sorts of moral propositions I've been talking about. That the reality that AI hasn't got there yet, okay, yeah, is besides the point here for me. Remember, I'm thinking about how can engaging with AI ethics help me think about theological, philosophical, ethical presumptions in Islamic thought. If, maybe when, okay, AI does have such capacity, okay, to recognize, okay, basic moral principles or inferred moral principles and choose to either follow or not follow them, then it seems to allow for the strong moral rationalisms, the SMRs, the strong moral rationalisms, seem to allow for AI choices to be felicitously described as praiseworthy or blameworthy. On a strong moral rationalism, this assessment is not simply in the sight of humans, it might also be in the sight of God too. Of course, reward and punishment are relative to the capacity of any agent, right? So something could be praiseworthy and blameworthy, but the accountability to that praise and blame varies, right? And this is consistent with the Shia account of divine justice, because ought implies can, all right? Or in a Quranic sense, we do not make a self responsible except in accordance with capacity. So to wrap up, Islamic meta-ethics and the possibility of ethical AI. The ethical appraisal of AI based on the virtuous or reputable opinions seems felicitous use of language at a human level. Okay, yeah, we can use some moral language, distinguishing between how we're using that moral language. Okay, yeah, when it comes to considering AI's teleology, its utility, and so on and so forth, irrespective of debates on divine command and moral objectivism. For strong moral rationalists, there seems to be further scope for transhuman moral agency. AI is potentially capable of knowing rational propositions and partaking in rational conventions, thus becoming subject to God's praise and blame. And of course, God's praise and blame is his reward and his punishment. Now, this line of analysis, this possibility which I'm opening up, of course, challenges visions of human exceptionalism. If it's grounded in the intellect, reason, or nous, or within the Islamic tradition, if it's grounded within the discourse of al-aql. And I think can prompt rethinking of what it means to be human and what it means to be godly. Thank you. Go, Shanna, thank you.
Wonderful talk again. This has been a great day. Really appreciated this day, which is not to say I didn't appreciate the other days as well, because I did. Anyway, the something I would just love your thoughts on, because I'm intrigued, is in the example of the bird and Solomon, I take it that it's somehow relevant that the bird cares whether it's labeled a liar or not. That seems relevant here. And I'm wondering if you could just run with that and just say a bit more about how what we're looking for in the possible future AI system or here must have to do with that as well, that it has to be not only that it can be assessed, but that it will care how it is assessed. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing us back to emotion. All right. Okay. If that's where you're going. So yeah, brilliant question. So I don't know, actually. I haven't thought about it too much, to be honest with you, Shannon. I just, the reason I raise it, well, actually, Sarah Talili raises it, arguing for arguing that the Quran doesn't need to be read, okay, in a androcentric way, okay, actually trying to position, it's part of a discourse of, ecological discourse, and it's about animals in the Quran, actually, right? Okay, so what I want to say is, look, there you've got cases of moral actors. You've got moral actors who are non-human beings, right? Now, yes, I think you're right. I should mine into that more to say, okay, what are the other features that we can infer about those non-human moral actors? Where is their care, so on and so forth, right? But yeah, does it care? You would, I guess you would. I think so, yeah, because even if you just think about those terms of praise and blame, right? Okay, praise and blame, kind of, these are relational, right? If somebody praises you, you feel good. If somebody blames you, you feel bad. So I hadn't thought about it that way, and I will think further about it. So I would assume that yes, the bird does care. And
it's fascinating. And I think you've already made some of this point, but the distinction there between sort of guilt and innocence, which might just be a straight factual judgment, and praise and blame, which does require you to care whether you're praised or blamed. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's Abyssinian, right? Okay, which will have Aristotelian roots. Okay, yeah. So we're talking about, yeah, often social blame as well. So sometimes they talk about, is something praiseworthy or blameworthy by other human agents or other rational agents? They're still using the discourse of reason. Okay, so when is something praiseworthy and blameworthy in the eyes of other moral beings? We might want to reframe it, or other moral agents. Go. I don't know the order, actually. Maybe Thomas, I could go in the order I see. Thank you, Shannon. You're on mute, Thomas.
Thank you. I'm inspired to, in a comparative mood, put John Calvin in as an Ash'ari theorist now. I would love to just reread him according to that school. I think it would be really productive. But just to push on Shannon's point a little bit, because praise and blame have been written about a lot by folks in my lab and our colleagues in moral psychology as being practically just almost unavoidable in a social setting. But I'm interested in punishment. Putting aside whether the object of punishment cares about it or not, praise and blame have been kind of couched in reinforcement terms of cost and something like that. But punishment, I think, is especially intriguing of how you project that what punishment means for something that may not have vulnerability in the same way as imagined. So any quick thoughts you had about that would be great.
Yeah, so great question. So I don't know whether there's a work by John Hare on divine command theories, where he does a comparative work. You know, he used Christian, Jewish, and Muslim questions on divine command. I've forgotten the name of the book exactly. It's John Hare. He does it, and so he again he looks at, I can't remember whether he uses Calvin, to be honest with you, but he's basically wants to push for a modified divine command theory. But that's on your first kind of question, right? On praise and blame, so this is really it's part of the nub of the more mature debate between the Ash'aris and those who are against the Ash'aris, right? Okay, is look, does praise and blame, okay, from other moral agents correlate to praise or blame from God, right? Because what the Ash'aris would say, it's not about praise or blame, the third sense, the important sense. The moral sense is not about praise and blame. It's about divine reward and punishment. Okay, yeah. Those the she formulation which I gave towards the end was saying that, look, if something is factually praiseworthy or blameworthy, okay, then surely God also, okay, is aware of that, if you like, and concurs with that, right? So punishment then. So if we say, okay, blame from the perspective of God, okay, or is a form of punishment. Blame is a form of punishment. Praise is a form of reward, right? So one of the classical examples they would give of something which is rationally praiseworthy, they say, okay, look, thanking a benefactor. Okay, to thank somebody is praiseworthy. If you don't thank a benefactor, this is blameworthy, right? So what's the blame? It's like, you know, you held the door open for somebody, okay, and didn't acknowledge it, and they looked at me funny. They said, you could have at least acknowledged it, right? That blame's a form of punishment. Yeah, it's a form of punishment. And of course, that's relative to the actor then. So what I want to do also, I think that's very, very important if we're thinking about the possibility of your AI agents. So even if we think about children, for example, we think about diminished responsibility. We could talk about that actually being praiseworthy or blameworthy, all right? But the punishment and accountability which a child would be held to, okay, for a blameworthy act is going to be different from an adult. So these are always proportional to capacity.
Thank you.
Later. So our next presenter is Gretchen Huizinga, who's a research fellow and board member of AI and Faith, and recently completed her PhD at the University of Washington with a dissertation titled Righteous AI, the Christian Voice in the Ethical AI Conversation. So Gretchen, the floor is yours.
The floor or the screen or both. I will share my screen in a second, but I just want to echo everybody's praise of all the papers and all the thinking and all of the conversations that are going on. It's just incredibly enriching. I can't keep track of the sticky notes that I'm writing nor saying because we don't have time. And I also think, Braden, that this is another example of you putting things together. Ali-Reza's talk is just perfectly aligned to maybe the last sort of 4 or 5 here from particular religious faith perspectives. And so, like Ahmed, I'm not a philosopher. My main introduction to the work of great philosophers was the Monty Python Philosopher's Song in high school. And it was a while before I actually understood that Descartes' most famous statement wasn't "I drink, therefore I am." So I'm coming at this also from an emic perspective or an insider's perspective. I'm presenting one voice in the conversation. I'm not seeking to silence others. I'm just bringing one voice. And my paper doesn't address directly the 3 questions for virtuous AI. It's sort of adjacent because the topic is righteous AI. And this is a condensed version, the paper that anyone might have read, of my dissertation. So I'm presenting the research more than writing a paper for this conference. And it's still developing, like Matt said. This is work in progress. I may be the oldest postdoc you've ever met. I often say this ain't my first rodeo, but this is my first rodeo. So hang on, buckle up. We're going for a Christian voice in AI ride. I'm going to share my screen. As you may have read, there's a lot of hope and hype, promise and peril conversation around AI today. If you follow the science, they're spending billions, tens of billions on what AI can do. And in ethics, they're also spending millions on what AI should do. And I note here that most of what comes out of AI ethics literature is an admonition of what we should do, and very little in terms of how we can and why we should, except that it's good. So let's begin with Supertramp, as I always do. AI scientists are categorizing AI as a wonderful, a miracle, beautiful, magical. If you're following me, it's the logical song. Also from high school, I'm going back a ways. But AI ethicists say it should be sensible, logical, responsible, practical, dependable. You get the drift. What should we call it? The default mode is ethical. I'm swimming around with a lot of people in this pond right now. Microsoft calls it responsible AI, and I happen to know that they did a lot of consulting with people on what word we should fall on that will convince people that our AI is good and benevolent, and you should be not afraid to use it. I like how this conference is framing it in terms of virtuous AI, which takes, I think, ethics a step up. But I would argue, and as you'll see as it unfolds, I do argue, I kind of skipped virtuous AI, although virtue ethics is a huge part of what we talk about in the Christian voice. But I've landed on the term righteous AI. Already had some pushback in terms of the connotation and baggage that the word righteous carries in terms of self-righteousness and judgmentalism, but I'm aiming for the Christian vision of God's righteousness through Christ. And so it doesn't have bad connotations. If you unpack it, it is what we're aiming for. A little background, and this is how I anchored my research, was that primarily the worldview that's producing the majority of AI today is a materialist framework. And so that worldview informs a lot of how AI is made and ultimately how it's used. In this conversation, religious voices writ large have been marginalized or silenced because they're not scientific. But we're talking about ethics, and Christianity makes some bold truth claims about the why and how of moral behavior, not just the what. And so my meta question was, what does the missing voice say, and what can we learn? So the purpose of my study was to investigate how Christian texts, teachings, and traditions might make a valuable contribution to AI ethics. And my thesis was the humanistic ethical principles are necessary but not sufficient, or necessary but insufficient, to ensure robust and benevolent AI. I have a couple of permutations on this wording, but this is where I've fallen for this. I also, as a subtext, say that acknowledging divine intelligence and a rightly ordered understanding, again, a nod to Augustine, of human intelligence is necessary to ensure robust and benevolent humans, if that makes sense. So in other words, to some degree, the conversation has kicked out divine intelligence from the equation, we'll say, and began with human intelligence, and then to artificial, or as I like to call it, machine intelligence. But I think we need to reinsert divine intelligence in our theology, anthropology of artificial intelligence. And by the way, I agree that artificial intelligence is a misnomer on multiple levels, but I'm calling it that for convenience. Also, I'll just note that Brad Smith, the president of the company I currently work for, gave me an actual invitation in his book, Tools and Weapons. You can read the quote, but ultimately, we need more than just technologists and governments and NGOs and educators, but philosophers and representatives of the world's many religions. Now, philosophers have entered the debate much earlier than the religions have, and been accepted a little bit more. So I'm coming in and I'm bringing a voice. A word about ethics in terms of how I also framed this study. I understand from a tangential, as I said, I'm not a philosopher, so I can't speak with authority on the philosophical traditions of ethics, but there are three that sort of lead up to what I'll say where I anchored this study is in Christian ethics. So if you look at deontological as normative, duty-based, teleological as utilitarian morality and outcome-based, virtue ethics as dispositional morality and character-based, I would say Christian ethics are transcendent morality and Christ-based. And it also kind of anchors in which acts, attitudes, and personal character traits receive God's approval and which do not, which Ali-Reza actually said in his too. It's basically God's the boss. If we say who decides, Christians would say, well, God decides, and we need to go back to the transcendent texts and teachings. Methodology of my study was basic qualitative research. It was modified ethnography because I did everything by Zoom interview during COVID. Several people in this conference were contributors to the data. Thank you all who did. My data collection was a semi-structured interview protocol, and I used a constant comparison analysis method, which was important because my initial foray into the study turned out to be an irrelevant sort of question. And I immediately got feedback that that's not the point. And so I switched horses midstream, as they say, to use more cliches. My sample was purposeful. The people that I interviewed had to know certain things. They could neither be ignorant of religion nor ignorant of AI on some level. I looked for a typical sample. I'll call it Goldilocks. They shouldn't fall on either extreme. It turned into a snowball sample. I know a guy, or I know a person. It was a small sample of 21, but to quote my idol, Harry Wilcott, what can we learn from studying only N of anything, all we can? And it ended up being non-random, but oddly representative. And so to paraphrase another great in ethnography research, Clyde Kluckholm, every Christian is like all other Christians, like some other Christians, and like no other Christian. This is true of people as well. So my research questions were kind of a duh one, but I wanted to hear from these people. How does worldview affect our approach to AI? Does the Christian worldview have anything unique to contribute to AI ethics? And why this is important to me is because there's a lot of conversation going on, even with religious overtones, that sort of swims in the same lane as all the other ethics research going on. And all of that is important, but what does the Christian worldview say uniquely or differently? And then how do Christian texts, teachings, and traditions, there's my 3-point sermon, make a valuable contribution to AI ethics? Begins as a tale of two worldviews. I won't go through this because most of you are already familiar with the main tenets of materialism. And I would imagine some, if not all of you, are familiar with the main tenets of Christianity, whether it's through your own faith or just osmotic transfer. How's that for a biology thing? Findings overview. I think we should have a general thing, and what we found was maybe it's a book or a song, but the main overview was worldview absolutely informs our approach to AI and AI ethics. And that's the question where you say you needed research to tell you that. Not necessarily, but it does confirm. And then where I landed on the massive amounts of qualitative data and teasing out the main differences is that Christianity proposes what we're up against in terms of spiritual evil, human sin, and the tendency toward idolatry when we're talking about AI and AI ethics. And it also proposes where we find our ethical moorings in a transcendent vision of morality. And in this term provenance, which I'll dig into a little bit in a minute, but it's like where things come from. And finally, the main value proposition of the Christian faith, which is love. Not that that's exclusive to other religious faiths, but it is an anchor pinning of Christian tradition. And also, finally, Christianity has already made a valuable contribution to AI ethics, but it's not getting credit. Many of the Catholic contributors had a historical take on where morals and values and ethics come from. And a lot of it is sort of a copy paste of Christian or religious ethics writ large and put into a secular framework. Just a couple on each of these big themes and some quotes and a takeaway. When we're talking about spiritual evil, it's one of my participants said, as Christians, we already believe in a super intelligence that is malicious toward us. So there's this Satan thing. Not everyone believes in the devil, but generally Christians do. And in the world of secular technologists, there isn't really a category for evil. They understand programming errors and mistakes, but they have a category for bad things happening. But the idea of personal malevolence just doesn't make sense. And so they've created this category of the bad actor, which I love because it's always someone else that's the bad actor, never us. And in some worldviews, there isn't even a spiritual bad actor. But the takeaway here for me was that ethical principles and laws are good, but if we really believe in evil, which not everyone does, but Christians do, ethical principles are no match for evil. The second one in the same line is human sin, which is, again, some religions believe in total depravity and human sin, and some have sort of a different take on it. In the Christian worldview, original sin is one of the main tenets. Original sin is completely real. The problem is we don't have just bad algorithms, or we just have injustice. It's actually, we have a sin problem. It's rebellion against God, our designer and creator. So from a Christian perspective, it would be smart to factor sin into the AI product roadmap, not just the bad actor. Idolatry is a big theme in the Bible, and some of the comments in the study were, am I causing people to love other things more than God, which is an interesting take on AI. And this also was one of my favorite quotes. What the Christian tradition has to say, and say very loudly, is that don't let this become a substitute either for God or one another. It's looking for a new salvation, a new eschatology in this technology, and it's making a do-it-yourself project. So I say AI's oracular attributes increase the chances that people will seek to put their trust in Google or now GPT rather than God. And in terms of the moorings for our ethical beliefs and actions, the overriding thing was that there is a transcendent standard. And because one of the big questions that floats around is who gets to decide? Whose ethics are we going to choose? And this is a really good question, even within religious traditions. As Ali-Reza points out, there's different Muslim traditions, there's different Jewish sects, and within Christianity, it's crazy how many. There's a couple big ones, and then a bunch of small ones in amongst them. But if your worldview has no transcendent dimension, then your default mode is, well, if it can be done, it should. And unless we acknowledge that, we're in trouble. And the message of the gospel is that your biggest problem has already been solved, right? Rest in me. So in essence, we need a transcendent standard to avoid ethics drift. From a Christian perspective, again, and I'll get to this at the end to why this is simply how this plays out across a broader audience. But from the Christian perspective, we cannot AI our way to transcendence here or hereafter. And this, I think, addresses some of the transhumanist claims that are being made and have been brought up in a lot of the papers to date. So this word provenance is really kind of a museum and art anchored thing, but it's made its way into machine learning models in terms of the importance of data provenance. And we see the harms that result when the data isn't good, or when the data is limited, or when the data is biased, simply because that's what people chose to use to train the model. And whether it was intentionally malicious and racist or biased or whatever is less the point, then that's what it is. And people have been uncovering the fact that data provenance is a hugely important thing in AI models. And so I argued and questioned what about the provenance of ethics? Where does it come from? And here we find some people saying there are things about our current worldview that we take for granted, but they weren't there before the Christians showed up. We owe the church a debt of gratitude for what it was able to do in spreading values along with the good news. And then also those who embrace what's fundamentally Christian ethics without Christ are using a form of moral auto-tune. Maybe you can tell who that was by one of our former presentations, but that's one of my favorite quotes of the whole study. So in a sense, Christians might argue if we need humans in the loop for robust and beneficial AI, we need Jesus in the loop for robust and beneficial humans. And again, this is the Christian value add argument or argument in general. And again, we'll get to how that plays out later. And finally, we landed on the idea of love. Interestingly, you see some of the scriptures that say God is love and love the Lord your God with all your heart. You don't see God is cognition, although he is, but those aren't the scriptures we land on. So we aren't, as one of my participants said, primarily thinking things, we're primarily loving things. And another said, maybe what we need to be enhancing is love, but we're going for enhanced intelligence. Our pathway to divinity is through love, not through intelligence. Not that the two don't go together, not that there's no call for intelligence, not that God isn't the ultimate intelligence, but that love is more fundamental to his essence. So the basis for ethical AI could be built on the central value proposition, which is love. And again, we'll get to what that looks like. Again, I am a postdoc, so there's more to be done in this, in sort of fleshing out where we landed or where I landed. But it does land beyond ethics. In terms of my thesis, ethics is necessary but not sufficient. So some of my participants said things like, obviously laws and regulations are necessary, but what goes beyond? How does this technology speak of who we are? And another was, our unique concern isn't merely ethics. It's the kingdom of God, its glory, its vitality, its life, its overflowing life. And so I think ethics and rules are never going to match up to that kind of vital force in a person's life. It's far greater. And by the way, I know I'm not the first person to use the term beyond ethics. I think Derek Sherman, who's one of the participants in another city, has an entire chapter in one of his great books called Beyond Ethics. So kudos to all those who came before. I propose then that we move from a Christian perspective away from this idea of ethical AI. It's good, but it's not strong enough, high enough, pointed enough to what we're aiming for. And all of this other is good, you know, responsible, equitable, traceable, governable, etc., going back to Supertramp. But where we're really aiming is righteousness. And participants were saying, when it comes to technology, we need to be not seeking power, we need to be seeking goodness and ultimately holiness, if we want to phrase it biblically speaking. Without that, power will end up destroying us. Ultimately, we need to make technology holy. And I note God never says in the Bible, be ethical as I am ethical. He says, be holy as I am holy. And so the framework looks toward, interesting like Jesus, a downward mobility approach from Philippians chapter 2. Jesus, though he was God, did not seek to make equality with God a thing, but humbled himself. And so this humility approach and the project of blessing is what righteousness looks like. And if we want to manifest God's way of life, it's love, joy, peace, patience, the fruits of the Spirit. Those will be the data points that will be true of you. I should note that the Christian tradition says, you're sinful and there's hope for you in the blood of Jesus, but you're still not going to be perfect. We'll still have trouble being ethical, responsible, righteous, even with all of that. And I think that's been historically proven, but it's true of all of us. So to wrap it up towards the end here, ethics is necessary but insufficient. Humans make principles, ethics, rules, regulations, and laws. These are good. We have to set up guardrails so that we've articulated what we collectively believe is right and wrong. And in Psalm 119, it talks about, David talks about God's laws, testimonies, ways, precepts, statutes, commandments. And it talks about how much he loves those things because they are good, they're protective, they lead us on a path toward righteousness, upward, etc. So I would contend that human ethics and laws are only signposts and guardrails. They're good, but that's all they can do. Human ethics and laws change over time and within cultures. I think we've seen that, and this is part of the problem with saying, well, whose ethics and morals do we go to? Is it, you know, at this time, some of the things we're seeing as purportedly good in 2023 were illegal a half a century ago, at least in this country, and some places we still see this changing ethical bar, as it were. And we also would contend that human ethics and laws have not and never will change us. The law cannot change us. We can only be changed through regenerative transaction. So in essence, we're only ever going to be asymptotically approaching righteousness on earth. And yes, I do know what an asymptote is, even though I can't do the math for machine learning. But here's some math. And I did have to check whether PEMDAS was still a thing. I heard in sort of the math wars that it wasn't, but everyone assured me in the last talk I did that it was. So if in the order of operations for intelligence, God would say that he is the P, he's the parentheses, the first thing you do. Fear the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One is understanding, from Scripture. And from a Christian perspective, we would say, what is the PEMDAS for ethics, the biblical PEMDAS? And in God's order of operations for righteousness, we find that P in Jesus. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So there's nobody who's perfectly right or righteous to begin with. And then we're commanded to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added. All these things being all the goodness in life, the things that we seek after in terms of the end and bad ends, like profit, privilege, power, the three bad P's, I would say, but also this culminating contention or argument in Christian thought, which is that Jesus is our righteousness, and in him we find it. So in 2 Corinthians 5, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. This is imputed righteousness, not earned. And that is an interesting conversation in and of itself. So as I finished my dissertation and had review from the committee, one of them said, well, what does that look like? What would it look like if you had righteous AI? So I did a little thought experiment. And again, I can't play this all the way out. As they say, we need more research. Mama needs a new pair of shoes. So if Jesus was the CEO of a major tech company, if we take his teachings, it would be powerful but restrained, holy but humble, mighty but merciful, all-knowing but all-loving. We might make money, but we wouldn't love money. We would optimize for the good of others. We would prioritize peace. We would love our enemies and pray for our persecutors. We would confound the trolley problem by leaving 99 sheep to find one. And we would allow for the inefficiency and friction and messiness, as Shannon pointed out earlier, of human existence. We see this over and over, that the interruptibility and the non-machineness of Jesus was a really interesting characteristic of his life while he was here. So the question you're all going to ask is, well, will it play in Palo Alto? And I don't know. I mean, Ted Peters emailed me and said, you better ask that question. Do you expect Christianity to be an overlay for the tech bros? No. And I would say in my paper, in my dissertation, which isn't in this slide deck, there is an Overton window of, the slider that goes what's acceptable and policy versus what's fringe. But I argue in my dissertation that Christianity has always been very comfortable on the fringes, and that it doesn't seek to become policy in governments or industries, what it seeks to become policy in is the heart of believers who then act out their gratitude to God for his salvation and become sanctificationally more like Jesus. And then hopefully you would start to see people making decisions, if they're in authority, to not going after the profit at the expense of morals or ethics, to being willing to be self-sacrificing because they believe God will take care of them. And there's a bunch of other ways this plays out. And I will say one other thing before I close, and that is that I was asked by Ed Lazowska, who was the head of the computer science department at the University of Washington and on my committee, to address some major problems that AI practitioners wrestle with, like autonomous weapons and moral machines. And how I answered that was, ask 5 Christians, you'll get 5 answers. Even on moral machines, it's like, well, should we even try to make them? Or on autonomous weapons, you'll have some people, the Catholic tradition says, ban them all and ban them now. But there are other people who say, if we don't do them, we'll be sitting ducks for the people who don't go along with that. So you've got that whole spectrum. And I, again, embrace the idea of messiness as part of this weird thing that God did when he made us. And then we are the initial AI, if you want to put it. We're the rogue AI that he allowed to go rogue and loves us anyway and says he wants to woo us back. So that's it. Mic drop. Questions? Do I stop share? Yeah, Ron, mute.
Yes. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate your forthrightness about theological language. Obviously, not everybody's going to adopt your language, and for what it's worth, I would want to be forthright, but would probably use very different terms. So, one of your key words is righteousness, and I'm not sure I would use that, but again, I appreciate the intent. And when you spell out the features of what this means practically, I don't think anybody would argue with you that that's a very compelling and appealing list. But just on the issue of righteousness, that's a pretty complex term, although retired, I think, from active use in a lot of circles, but still a complex term. Now, I don't know if we have any Lutherans on the phone call here, but I see Ted Peters reacting. One of the most pivotal and pivotally important essays is Martin Luther's The Two Kinds of Righteousness. And as I read your essay, and then you had a quick line tucked in there, you said imputed righteousness. I'm not sure that that's where you want to go. I think it's the second kind of righteousness, to use Luther's typology there, not the first by which we are imputed and justified, but the second by which the Holy Spirit works in us and achieves in each believer actual righteousness. So it's not Christ's righteousness imputed to us, it's the work of the Spirit of Christ making us actually righteous. And I think Luther's got that clearly in mind. It's certainly pivotal to, I think, the history, at least, of the mainstream Protestant traditions. And for what it's worth, I think it's not always so vibrantly grasped, at least in some manifestations of contemporary American evangelical Protestantism. Here's where I think the old-fashioned stuff actually has a deeper stratum to tap into. Anyway, that's a long way around of saying this is absolutely fascinating, and I again applaud the forthrightness of the theological language, and I'd be happy to follow up later if you have any interest on this typology of righteousness.
I would love that. And I would also say I agree with that. The idea of justification and sanctification ultimately leading to glorification are some theological heavy terms. And the idea that we can earn our righteousness, I think, is where I landed on the early part of the term, but absolutely, you don't just say, okay, that's that, and now I don't have to follow any teaching or anything like that. That's certainly not, but I love that. I think that's great.
Last but certainly not least, we have Lawrence Whitney, who is a research associate at the National Museum of American History with the Smithsonian and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Mind and Culture in Boston. He's a fellow of the New Visions in Theological Anthropology Project at University of St. Andrews, a current Sinai and Synapses Fellow, as I am, and that's how I've gotten to know him, and a professed and priest in the Lithis-Farned community.
Hopefully that's working. Grateful to be with you all and grateful for all the papers. I'll just start by noting that I'm well aware that the folks who have been limited in their interaction to the Q&A box, I don't have any capacity to respond to your questions in that box since this will end as soon as we're done with my paper. So please do put your email address there, and I'd be happy to get back to you afterwards about any questions you might have. My goal this afternoon is to briefly go over the paper I wrote about Confucian role ethics and artificial intelligence, introduce the idea of Confucian ethics in a virtue ethics frame, and talking mostly about the way roles function within that as a way of grappling with how AI might fit as a virtuous agent vis-a-vis humans, potentially other animals, and things like that. So, figure we need to start. And did my slide just change? You're seeing that? Oh, good. Okay. The technology is behaving. This is a good thing for this hour of the conference. A few key ethical terms that you need to know to be able to function in Confucian thought. The first is the notion of a junzi. This is a term that was adopted by Confucius from much earlier than Confucius in ancient China, but he kind of meritocratized it to become something of a moral exemplar. And so the goal in Confucian ethics for individuals participating in Confucian societies is to become a noble person, a moral exemplar, a junzi. And what it means to do that is to become virtuous, to become humane in Chinese parlance, run, and that has that's a very broad, very abstract kind of concept. What does it mean to be humane? Well, that depends on a lot of different things. So it's in some cases it does translate directly as the Confucian term for virtue. It does fit into a broader cosmic perspective of Tao. Tao in Confucius' time was an internal moral principle, and it would, through the Confucian tradition and also the Taoist tradition in China, become cosmologized to certainly social principles or ways. And we'll see how that plays out in a bit. And then also transcendent cosmic ways and principles. And a lot of the goal in Confucian and, quite frankly, Taoist philosophy and spirituality has to do with aligning yourself with the moral ways and principles of the universe, of your society, and that are of your family, and that are part of your way of being in the world. Another piece that I get into fairly extensively in the paper is the concept of yi, which is appropriateness. And this has a lot to do with how you are humane, how you are virtuous in a particular situation. So like Aristotelian virtue ethics, Confucians are very concerned with how to do that, how to be virtuous under a variety of different situations. And that can what a given virtue looks like in a given situation may look different than what it looks like in another situation. And then finally, li, ritual. This is where things start to get a little bit different, and where the notion of role begins to emerge. Although I in the paper I problematized the idea of relating the notion of role too closely to that of ritual, but the notion of ritual is not simply religious ceremonies, but it has to do with all of the patterns of behavior and norms for our interactions with other human beings and with families and societies and cultures and with everything else in the world. The 10,000 things, as Confucians would call it. And so the rituals have to do with pattern and habit and behavior. And it is normalized. There are norms for how to behave in certain relationships, right? And those relationships are defined in part by the roles of the people in those relationships, and those relationships define those roles in a variety of ways. So those are sort of my 5 key terms for Confucian ethics. There we go. Let's get a little bit deeper into roles. I argue that rather than identifying roles too closely with with ritual, we do better to think of roles emerging from the concept of xiao, of filiality, sometimes translated filial piety. The way in which that happens is that filiality defines the relationships within the family initially, particularly responsibilities of children for their parents, particularly responsibilities of the first male child for their parents. Don't want to give the idea that Confucianism is not incredibly misogynistic in its historical incarnations. It is, much like most of our Western philosophical traditions, to be quite honest. There's a very, very heavy emphasis on the role and responsibility of the first male child. And out of this, this pivots during the Warring States period, the same time that Confucius is reworking the notion of a junzi, he's also reworking the notion of xiao, of filiality. And it begins to transform so that it's not just about what are the proper relationships between children and parents and children, and because it does also go the other way, there are responsibilities parents have for their children. Suddenly, it also has to do with things like how do soldiers relate to generals? How do ministers relate to rulers? How do commoners relate to village leaders, relate to regional leaders, relate to imperial leaders, right? So it begins to take on a much broader conception. And the very definition of role emerges from this, that you have a role, just like you do in your family. You are the child sometimes you're the child and other times you're the parent, potentially. But for example, to begin with, your role is that of a child. That role doesn't make any sense without considering the parents you are the child to, right? So that relationship, that parent-child relationship, is definitive of what it means for you to be a child and what it means for your parents to be your parents. And you have certain responsibilities, certain duties that are understood to be manifestations of virtue, of the virtue of humaneness overall, of all sorts of other middle and lower level virtues that are particular, and we'll get into that in a minute, to those particular roles. But this notion of role and the notion of norm, and that these roles have norms associated with them, have rituals associated with them. There are particular ritual ways of engaging with your parents, how many times you bow to parents, to grandparents, all those kinds of things, that govern how those roles are to be enacted in society. Those are understood to be manifestations of virtue. But they can come across as awfully deontological, right? So there is a big question in Confucian philosophy, and you'll see me parsing it out through the paper, of is role ethics really a virtue ethic or not? I argue that I take it to be a version of virtue ethics for the purpose of the paper, at least. I do think of the sort of normative Western philosophical traditions, virtue, deontology, and consequentialism. Confucianism's best dialogue partner is Aristotelian eudaimonist virtue ethics, in terms of being able to make really detailed comparisons with a real room for dialogue between the two. One very famous Confucian philosopher, Mo Zongtan, argued that it's really a deontological tradition, he was very influenced by Kant and thought Kant was great and we should reinterpret Confucianism through Kant. I'm not so sold on that project, but that's out there. There's also a fair bit of folks who want to argue that it's best understood as a form of consequentialism. I won't get into that right now. A lot of the people who talk about Confucian role ethics really want to argue that it's not like any of those things. It's its own thing. It's its own distinctive version of normative ethics. I think that's not so helpful in trying to do something comparative. I can see why they're trying to do it for other reasons. And in some projects, it can be a good thing to do. But I think for my purposes, I think bringing it into conversation with virtue ethics is incredibly productive. I also think that bringing it into conversation with pragmatist ethics is really useful. And I personally identify more as a pragmatist ethicist than a virtue ethicist. So, like Dewey and other pragmatists have a great respect for the virtue tradition and the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics within that. So that's kind of positioning it a little bit comparatively. Interesting thing that emerges with these roles, there's beginning to be some recognition of how the tension between the norms governing a particular role and broader conceptions of virtue can come into conflict. That's been there in Confucianism since basically day one. We can find this in reading the Analects, certainly in Mengzi and Xunzi and their texts. I think, but the earliest framing of this I can find in the Aristotelian virtue ethics tradition is like 2011. So much more recent beginning to grapple with this, really. And what the role dilemma is just that, the conflict between the demands of a social role and the demands of virtue. And the way that Ramsey, who I call out in the paper, deals with that is by talking about, well, you kind of have to pick one. You either side with the virtue or you side with the norms of the role. And I don't think that's a great answer from within a Confucian perspective, largely because Confucians have been writing about this tension and finding ways to move through that without having to pick, right? And holding them together and harmonizing norms and virtues since day one. So I'm not a huge fan of Ramsey's way of doing that. I do identify in the paper that the main way that Confucian philosophers have done this is through the concept of yi, of appropriateness, and I spell that out in detail in the paper, but I'm not going to try to do that again here. For Confucian role ethics, one of the things it does that it expands upon the Aristotelian notion of virtues being sort of universal, or at least in contemporary virtue traditions influenced by MacIntyre, and especially as read through some post-liberal theologians, you get that they're communally defined, right? So universal, at least within a community. But it's certainly for Aristotle that virtues are universal. Everyone is to embody all of the virtues in all of the situations as they're called upon by the needs of the situation. Confucians have that too. As I said, humaneness is one. We can talk about appropriateness or li, or yi, or ritual or li as themselves virtues, and they would be understood as universal. But Confucians add on to that this notion that we have to express our universal virtues in our given roles. So what humaneness looks like as a child to my parents is very different than what humaneness looks like in my role as a soldier to a general, right? And the same person could be inhabiting both those roles. And that happened a lot in Chinese history, right? Of a child who goes off to war as a soldier is called upon to exhibit humaneness and a variety of other virtues. But it's going to look very different in the home than it is on the battlefield. And I think most of us would say rightly so. Some of that is situational, but it's defined more in Confucianism in terms of the roles, right? In terms of your relationship to your general, not in terms of your being on the battlefield. So what courage looks like emerges more from your role as a soldier, as a subordinate to a general and to other parts of the leadership structure of the military than, for example, it does just from the fact of you have certain moral things you yourself individually have to decide about on the battlefield. Then there are also virtues that are particular to certain roles. One of the ways I like to parse this out is the difference between deference and respect. Respect is a fairly universal virtue. Everyone is called upon to respect everyone. That looks different in different roles and relationships, but everybody should respect everyone. Not everyone's called upon to be deferential to everyone else, right? If you are an inferior, you are supposed to be deferential to a superior. There are some very nuanced discussions of how peers are deferential and not to each other in different contexts, and that too is role driven. But then there's the idea that a superior would in any way ever be deferential to an inferior simply does not compute in Chinese thought. And Confucianism particularly within that. So they had to build a workaround, and the workaround is the notion of remonstration. And this is the way that inferiors are able to tell their superiors, hey, you screwed up. This is a bad idea. You shouldn't do that, right? Again, I get into that a little bit more detail in the paper, but I'll kind of leave that here for now. But the very existence of that mechanism is a demonstration that just at the very sort of basic level of how deference works, it doesn't apply to everyone. It only applies from inferiors to superiors for sure, and then some wacky stuff going on around peers. There are some benefits to this addition of the notion of roles. One is flexibility. It is you can much more flexibly incorporate a variety of kinds of moral actors and recognize the differences between and expectations between different moral actors, even within a society, right? This is a problem just as much for humans as it is for when we begin to talk about humans and animals or humans and AI. There's a major cost, though. It gets really complicated really quickly. How do you know what your role? Do you always know what your role is? A good Confucian would say you certainly should, but sometimes it gets complicated, especially in our late modern societies when we don't always know what our roles are. Figuring out which norms apply to which roles in which situations, and figuring out when virtue calls on us to break the norms of our roles. And one of the big ways we see this happening now in China, or going back to the notion of filiality, is that women historically have not had the same responsibilities for their parents as men. But with the one-child policy, there are a lot of families with only daughters. So there's no one to take care of the parents if the daughters don't have any responsibility for them. And so that understanding of the norms of how daughters and parents relate to each other is shifting, because otherwise there's no social safety net for an increasingly aging population in China. So yeah, the roles can and do shift. And then you've got to figure out how the virtues all play out in the midst of that. What does this have to do with AI? Great question. So I lay out a moral topography of Confucian ethical analysis. That's a really fancy set of terms. It's good in philosophy papers to come up with the most technical terminology you possibly can. No, it's not, but you know, we all do it. The first thing you've got to do is figure out how do universal virtues apply in a particular situation. Then you've got to figure out what your role and your relationships are in a given context with other people in that situation. See how those universal virtues apply within those roles. Decide then what particular role-based virtues may come into play given your role. or roles, and keeping in mind we may be playing multiple roles in a given situation. If you're the major in the army, you both have to supervise the soldiers and report to the general. So, you know, you're both a superior and an inferior simultaneously. Lots of military metaphors in Confucian and examples in Confucian philosophy. And then you've got to figure out how do you realize those virtues in the relationships as they are at play in the given situation. And then again, you have to resolve any conflicts between the universal and the particular virtues, and figure out how to generate harmony. Harmony is another big concept in Confucian philosophy that I didn't get into here, but that's the ultimate goal. And the Tao as a principle is supposed to lead you to harmony. So I then apply this analysis to the topic of self-driving cars, which I'm glad to see was brought up already today. And I did stick that article about Tesla's rather disastrous failure with regard to developing self-driving cars that came out today. The self-driving car problem, I think, is really important for virtue ethicists to think about, largely because we haven't much historically. It's as Catherine rightly pointed out, it's a real like practical problem for people developing artificial intelligences, right? It's not just some utilitarian thought experiment. It's we got to design this car. Or we're trying to design this car. I think we've well problematized over the course of the conference. So it's one I think that virtue ethicists would do well to think through. In terms of bringing this up, just a few things I bring out in the paper in terms of roles. Even the notion of what the role of a self-driving car is can get complicated very quickly. On the one hand, it's a vehicle moving something from one place to another, right? Sometimes it's moving humans. Sometimes maybe it's not, right? Sometimes it's Uber Eats and is bringing you your dinner. And it may have to bring different virtues into play given that functional difference in role, right? Between maybe it's okay if your dinner goes splat on the side of the road. Not so good if a human being's in the car, right? And it has to crash into a wall to avoid hitting people on the side of the road. But there's also role problems, right? Maybe you own the car, but if the car is owned by Uber, then how does that change its role, right? And its set of relationships, its relationship to you as a passenger, its relationship to other people on the side of the road, right? And so you may actually have to think about the virtues that a car brings into play in deciding what to do in these extraordinary circumstances differently, based on the roles that it's playing. I do touch very briefly on the topic of large language models like ChatGPT in the paper. It gets a whole whopping paragraph. There's a lot more that could be said. I talk about it mainly in terms of AI hallucinations. And one way of approaching a large language model in terms of, for example, the problem that has recently happened of a lawyer having relied on ChatGPT that just invented court cases, right, is maybe we need to program some character into it of like truthfulness, right, and honesty. But maybe that's also not quite right. Maybe that's not, maybe we need to be training the people using it, right? Maybe that's not the role of ChatGPT. Maybe it's the role of the person who's adopting it as a research assistant to be more skeptical and check up on things, which I believe the judge who was overseeing that case pointed out in very clear terms in a hearing late last week, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot that the role analysis, I think, can help us with in terms of thinking about what virtues might and how they might apply. The last piece I dive into is the differences in philosophical anthropology going on between Confucian thought and Aristotelian virtue ethics, and how that plays out vis-a-vis artificial intelligence implants. For For Aristotle, he's got a conception of humans having animal bodies and rational souls. I describe in the paper a little bit about why that leaves Aristotelians at least potentially open to the notion of an AI implant. This is different for the theistic inheritors of Aristotle in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, in that the underlying philosophical anthropology in those traditions is that of the imago Dei, right? That humans are made in the image and likeness of God. And it's probably a bad idea to go mucking around with what God has made. And there's a much stronger notion that human nature is fixed and that it's already at its maximum to a certain extent. That's not to say humanity hasn't fallen, fall being an important theological notion as well, but human nature, right, what we are in some sort of essence, is maximally good, having been created by God. Similarly, for Aristotle, the notion of eudaimonia is rather a fixed dimension, right? The human happiness that can be achieved is the ultimate good, and once you've achieved it, you've achieved it. And it's not clear that there's anywhere to go from there. All of this is very different in Confucianism. The Confucian word for human nature is xing, and it translates most literally as what we are born with. So it's our nature as we're born. And to a large extent, changing that nature as we are born with it is the whole purpose of the Confucian tradition. Figuring out how to become better people, more humane people. And so the notion of virtue, of humaneness, of what we're trying to achieve in living an ethical life is pretty unlimited. There's a lot of focus in Confucian discussions on the roots, the context, and the means of cultivating virtue. But there's also this sort of idea that as long as you keep doing the participating in the rituals, reading the classical texts, working to live a virtuous life, that process of moral self-cultivation will lead to more and more humaneness, infinitely, potentially. So to draw the comparison, Confucianism is an extremely Pelagian tradition, right? There's a lot we can do to work out our own salvation, and build a humane society. So that leaves Confucians a lot more open to the notion of AI implants, because if an implant could help you become more humane, not saying right now or even very soon that we're going to have that, but if it could, in principle, great. The more the better. And there's not these qualms about are we meddling with what God has made. We are meddling with what heaven and earth has made. Heaven and earth, Tiandi being the Chinese sort of analog to a theistic notion of ultimate reality. But we're supposed to. That's our point. That's our purpose in life, in many respects. So I'll just end by reading the conclusion of my paper. The conclusion to be drawn is that the Confucian approach to virtue ethics has a higher degree of tolerance for the idea that AIs may be able to play a role in improving humanity, our virtue, and our goodness. Insofar as US citizens reflect these Aristotelian impulses, a recent study from Pew Research Center shows that a majority in the US think neural implants would be bad for society, and 78% would not want such an implant, with these views skewed toward those with high as opposed to low religious commitment. China, on the other hand, is heavily influenced by Confucianism and shows greater openness to cloning, gene editing, and pursuing neural implant technologies. Some caution is warranted for the Confucians as well, though, given that while great progress is being made in terms of the interface aspect of neural implants, the AI that will eventually be interfaced still has a long way to go. Increased humaneness may not be the result of implanting an AI that is at once both smarter and dumber than any person you've ever met. So just as a final comment, I'll just say one of the reasons I think it's really important to be engaging with non-Aristotelian virtue ethics traditions in this conversation is that the Aristotelian version has developed in very weird society, weird meaning Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which has a very peculiar psychological makeup and does not express all of the concerns or lack of concerns from virtue ethics traditions around the world. So I think that as we think through virtue ethics approaches to AI, these comparative approaches are really particularly pressing. So I will stop there and open it up. Braden.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think for me, the sticking point, and this is probably because Ted has accused me of reading Niebuhr in a Pelagian way, but I think there's some Christian theology that would push back on on the strong dichotomy that you're trying to make.
Yeah.
I'm an ethicist, but the systematician that hides in me occasionally would say that if we really take cosmology and evolution seriously, then we just have to admit that Aristotle was wrong in terms of his biological science, and that Brian and I have had debates about the malleability of human nature previously, but I think that we have to acknowledge that human nature is maybe not as fixed as traditional Christianity once had us believe.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. And I think an interesting conversation partner would be to put what you're doing together with folks from the Christian Transhumanist Association.
Yep.
Who would sort of argue that it is our purpose to enact God's will in these modifications.
Right. Yeah. And I don't want to try to say that all of Christianity is Aristotelian via like Aquinas and that trajectory of inheriting Aristotle into Christianity. As Ted pointed out, was it yesterday or the day before, right? There's the whole Platonic tradition, right, as well, plus a whole bunch of other, influences within Christianity. Christianity is not monolithic any more than Confucianism is. But I think the Aristotelian tradition is still powerfully represented within certain branches of the Christian church. And so I think drawing those distinctions to see why Chinese folks are not reacting in the same way as a significant number of, for example, Americans who may be even just living with lingering conceptions of that is useful to do. Cyrus's comment here about making things, that's a piece I didn't have room to get into in the paper. Chinese thought has a lot to say about making things and the role of artifice in human life and moral life, and generally views our own moral self-cultivation as an act of artifice, right? So that leaves, again, a lot more, that's a whole nother paper, but a lot of openness to AI.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate the comparative work. I mean, I think that's essential and important, as you noted. So I think there seems to be some overlap here, especially in the contemporary influences of Confucian thought in my experiences in East Africa. So back to the paper earlier given about African perspectives and whether it's Ubuntu or just a more collective sense of self, there's a lot to be said about a comparison between what's happening in your paper and earlier contexts about the self as constituted by relationality that's rich now and happening in the world. So appreciate it.
Yeah, the fundamental unit in Chinese thought is not the individual, it's the family, which is a little bit different than other collective approaches. But yeah, Thomas.
Thank you. And just on that very last comment, I take it by family that includes ancestry in ways that the Western family doesn't really conceive of the same way of an ongoing presence of ancestors and ongoing role of piety toward them. And, I kind of shared in the messages around this work that is recent in human-robot interaction, where there's a lot of interest, especially at Colorado School of Mines, in Confucian thinking, really trying to develop Confucian robot ethics as a very practical, applied, what does a robot say in what type of context? And so I wanted to ask you if you could expand a little bit on remonstration, because that seems to be very key in terms of figuring out what kind of role, in what type of institution is going on, and what type of language applies in terms of, and there's been a ton of work on human robot teams of, when robot has a ton of information that no other human, including the leader of a team, has, how does a robot couch that? Of basically, like, if it were a person, it would say, I know stuff you don't, but you can't, that is losing serious face. Let's put that in terms of Chinese culture, some serious face issues. So yeah, anything that kind of occurs to you, just to riff on that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded, going back to the intellects, so Confucius' own sort of document, that's complicated, attributed to him anyway. There's actually, it's not in the intellects, it's in the classic of, it might be in the histories. He talks about the way that he's asked about remonstration and the importance of it and the role of it. And he talks about the way that he sort of goes up the hierarchy, and that the emperor has more officials whose sole job is to remonstrate with him, and then as you come down the hierarchy, they have fewer and fewer officials. But there are people appointed in the government whose sole job is to remonstrate with the officials, to get them to change their minds and tell them that, no, this isn't a good idea, this isn't right. But again, that's a particular role. That is an office in the government. And there are particular ways those people are expected to behave and to speak to the superiors, because they're still superiors. So there's a lot of ritual norms that govern those relationships, even though the entire job is telling them that they're wrong. And that applies in a family as well, although there it's not so much an individual person with that role as, children do have an obligation to remonstrate with their parents on occasion. But you have to be really careful about how you do it, because respect is really, really key and important. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot there in the tradition, but I think, and it's there's some interesting room for discussion too around the notion of intellectual humility, which I know the Templeton Foundation is also very interested in. And what would intellectual humility look like in a robot or an artificial intelligence, right? Because how they deliver information on the basis of having read every paper that's ever been written on pretty much anything is really key and important. And goes back to the medical paper from yesterday too, right? Is how are these AI assistants in the ER going to talk to the doctors? Are they going to just tell them, hey, you moron, you don't know what you're talking about? That's probably not going to go over well. Being married to a doctor, I can't imagine that going over well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Brian?
Yeah, thank you. This has been super interesting, and I find this dialogue between very different perspectives on AI to be incredibly important. So for example, Toby's paper earlier also absolutely super interesting. First of all, one quick question: does the Office of Remonstrator still exist in China today, or is that something that is no longer there?
Well, so it was part of the imperial system, right? Okay. Which no longer exists. There are some really interesting discussions about the role of remonstration in the Chinese Communist Party, and talking to foreign affairs people around that topic is really interesting. I don't know a lot of the details on it, but I mean, it's definitely come up, right? Where you see even Xi Jinping changing his mind on things, and you kind of go, why did that happen? And you can kind of infer there's stuff going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, maybe with the zero COVID policy change, for example. That's an interesting one.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is that maybe you can explain to me a little bit more about this idea of morals self-construction or seeing yourself as an artifact, because that, of course, is very different than Aristotelianism, which would say if something has an internal nature, then you cultivate it. And if you're changing it into something that it's not meant to be, then that's construction. So, classic example being a tree, of course. You cultivate a tree, and when you chop it down and make something out of it, you're constructing it. So just any thoughts on that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a lot of continuity between the notion of moral self-cultivation and that distinction. I think there's not, it's not that you are taking in constructing yourself. It's not that you're taking, taking one thing and turning it into, you're not taking a tree and turning it into a spoon, right? The way Shunzi talks about it is more like a rock, right? You start with a rock, and what you want to end up with is Michelangelo's David. And which is there in the rock to begin with, right? And he's chiseling away and removing things to turn it into this beautiful sculpture. And by the way, Confucian ethics is very aesthetically inflected in that way. So Shunzi's way of talking about it is that human nature is ominous, right? Human nature left to its own devices tends to get us into a lot of trouble. So Shunzi is the Augustinian in the bunch. And as opposed to Mencius, who takes human nature to be fundamentally good. Shunzi is the heretic. He gets kind of almost written out of the tradition after the Warring States period. Not totally, people are still reading him, but he's viewed as he got a lot of things wrong. He's also viewed as the one who opened the door to legalism, which is probably not an entirely fair reading, but unless all of you want to take responsibility for every thought all of your students have ever had. But Shunzi's idea is that, we're starting with this ominous nature that tends toward getting us into trouble unless we do the moral self-cultivation and turn it into something beautiful, right? So, I think, does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
I realize we're totally out of time.
Yeah,
Great.
I'm going to take moderator's privilege and follow up on that because I think that's part of what I was trying to get at in the sense of what I'm hearing in the context of what you're saying in terms of, let's say, something like, AI implants being a part of human enhancement. It seems like the Confucian tradition is much more open to a changing in roles, and that, this might allow us to do something we haven't done before, and this might change the way that we have to interact with people in such and such a situation.
Yep.
Whereas a Christian anthropology is going to say if we're built for a particular telos, we're still human until the point where we've changed ourselves to we now have a new telos, and whether or not that's appropriate or good or what that looks like, I still don't have a great sense of where that term of speciation is going to occur in terms of transhumanism or posthumanism. But it seems that there's a lot more flexibility in just sort of reassigning roles than in reassigning or reaffirming what a purpose is for a species or an individual.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of room for recognizing that people inhabit different roles at different times, right? Moving in roles is complicated. In principle, Confucianism should be a very meritocratic tradition, right? And as you become more and more humane, you should be able to move up through the hierarchy, right? That's kind of the vision. But as Gandhi said about Christianity, I would also say is true about Confucianism. It's a great idea, and it would be wonderful if somebody tried it. Confucianism has never been lived out in as meritocratic a way as, the early thinkers certainly, some of them anyway, left open the possibility of. Although there's a lot of folks working now on trying to think about how that might emerge. So yeah, your ability to move from a commoner to a noble class. There's not a lot of class movement in Confucianism. There's some, but it's actually like in Western society, actually has a lot to do with success on the battlefield. So
rather than necessarily moral worth. But there is the idea that the main goal of any Confucian is to become a minister in the government and to sort of move up and eventually become one of those ministers to the emperor, who can remonstrate and tell him he's wrong. So yeah, there and so those roles can change. Yeah. Thanks.
No, thank you. And I want to thank everybody for sticking with us for these past 3 days, especially the folks who have been attendees in the Zoom call where you haven't been able to actively speak or to be on camera. We really appreciate the insights you've been giving us in terms of questions and comments and suggestions. For the other panelists, I hope that we'll be able to continue in our private session tomorrow morning to sort of wrap things up. Have some discussion about a lot of the things we've talked about, and also think about some things moving forward. So again, thanks for a really productive past 3 days, and have a good evening.